so that people can clearly hear every question and answer.
Yes. Hi, my name is Candy. I read over your report, and I noticed that you pointed out several inconsistencies in Jasmine and Antonio's testimony, or rather statement. There were some inconsistencies with Officer Donald's statement that I felt addressed, and they centered on 3 points. Donald never commits to a number of shots fired in either of the 3 incidents. He never mentions Evers and O'Brien showing up on the scene, even though they drove right by him. Nor does he mention Thompson and Antonio and Jasmine's car as it drove by. And thirdly, he does not give any specifics on to what the men may have said to him, only giving vague things like they were cursing, whereas other witnesses clearly heard the men saying specific words. So I guess why didn't you address those issues?
Okay. Well, let me talk about those issues now, and I'll try to remember all 3, but if I forget, you can help remind me. I've reviewed a number of these kinds of incidents now, officer-involved shootings, with all kinds of different circumstances, and actually had some training about people, not just police officers, but anybody who's involved in a high-intensity kind of incident like this, where there's a lot of stress and adrenaline and everything going on. The fact that Officer Donald didn't, as you put it, commit to, or basically said he didn't recall how many shots he fired, I'm willing to accept that in terms of his focus being on what was happening to him and what was going on at the time. That's not unusual, and in fact, there's been other incidents, officer-involved shooting incidents, where that same thing has happened. The officer did not specifically recall. Officers are trained, once they commit to using deadly force, their training is to use that force until they feel the threat is eliminated, that the threat is gone. And that means basically shooting multiple shots. And at that, if you want to just try to spend a minute in the mind of an officer that is, facing a threat, their mind is not going to be in terms of counting the number of shots fired. They're going to be, they've committed to use deadly force, and they're going to do that until the threat is gone. Now, the number of shots through the investigation has been specifically determined. So whether he was consistent or inconsistent with that, I'm not sure would be a determination in terms of my assessment of the overall case. Because through the investigative measures, things like the weapon that he uses is immediately seized, and we know how many rounds were in the weapon when it started, we know how many are in there afterwards, and you can kind of do the math. And then you match that up to the number of spent shell casings that are located on the scene, and you can determine exactly the number of shots fired. Now the vehicles going by is, again, I don't look at it as an inconsistency, but I do actually in some ways look at it as corroborative of his focus. There is a phenomenon that people go through when they're faced with a threat that causes them to become very focused, and in some cases experience what's called tunnel vision, where their vision goes straight to the threat and it stays there. And it's an instinctive human reaction, on which a lot of research has been done, quite frankly. And if a case like this were to go into a courtroom, there would be experts on the stand that would testify about that kind of phenomena that I have to consider in terms of moving forward with a case in a courtroom.
He clearly states in his statement that he had been looking up and down Cooper Point, which the visibility is pretty good, before cornering the men in the woods. And then as he has the gun pointed at him, that's when Evers does pass by, and then they make radio contact. It seems odd to me that he doesn't mention that, because they were confirming that they were there. And he was saying, I'm alone, my only choice was to use force because I'm alone. But those officers were on the scene,
Yes.
entering the woods.
Yes. And I think the explanation that would be given to a jury in this case that they would have to consider is whether in fact that corroborates his statement that he was faced with a genuine threat and he was focused on that threat. So, this is kind of a good time for me to also say that, when I look at these cases, when I'm analyzing it, debating facts and talking about facts of a case like this in a public forum is necessary and useful and so forth. I don't want to discount that. But it is far, far different than discussing facts in a court of law and presenting evidence to a jury and putting on a case. So when I'm looking at a case like this, in terms of making decisions about charges, my framework is not so much what the public debate's going to look like. My focus is on what does this evidence look like in a courtroom? What might be admissible? What might not be admissible? What kinds of other evidence might be brought in terms of expert testimony and things like that? How's a jury likely to perceive this evidence? What kind of legal issues and legal rulings might be made? That's the framework. And so I take my 25 years of trial experience and I bring that to bear, having tried many, many, many cases, and I use that in my analysis. So and I only say that as a way to just give you some understanding that the way that I look at this case is from a very specific legal framework, which is different than when you're looking at it and talking about it in a public forum. Do we move to next questions?
Yeah, it's hard, I can't see the timer.
Oh, I turned it, when you were done, I turned it off, and so I didn't want his...
Oh, okay.
Let's move to the next.
And just the last one was, he didn't commit to any, saying anything of what the men would have been saying, and what some of the other witnesses heard were the men taunting him possibly. So why wasn't that addressed?
Again, well, his statement is what it is. My analysis of that is it's all in this consistent theme of there are issues and details about this event when he's faced with the threat that actually if he gave too much detail, I'd almost be suspicious of that, because to me that would almost seem unrealistic. The fact that there was detail, but that there was not precise detail in terms of things that somebody might do when they're calm, cool, and collected, like counting shots and all of those things. The fact that those were left out, to me, could argue either way. It could either be argued as an inconsistency, but it could also be argued as corroborative, particularly by an expert witness who would come into court, as corroborating the fact that he was genuinely facing a threat.
Okay. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah.
Okay, so Lisa's up next, and we're gonna make it so that you have 3 minutes to ask the comment, and then I'm gonna keep you to 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Probably a good idea.
Yes.
Yeah. I am a lawyer, so I tend to
We
talk.
noticed.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read through this, and there's a handful of questions in here, so
Okay.
maybe we should give more this. Based on the video evidence from the Safeway, it seems very hard to establish that there was actually an assault, let alone a shoplift or anything. I've looked at some of your previous cases in this jurisdiction where that level of evidence would have not resulted in an assault charge, or frankly an assault of any kind. So given the video evidence from Safeway, do you feel your charging decision in that part of this incident was consistent with other charges your office has filed in similar instances in this jurisdiction, especially considering where one of the men you charged wasn't even present? That's my first question. When you get beyond the officer's statement alone, there is no definitive evidence from the Washington State Crime Lab that directly supports the officer's version of events. But there are pieces of evidence that seem to refute his statement. The lack of gunpowder particles on the clothing of Andre and Bryson indicates that the muzzle-to-target distance was greater than the drop-off distance, which was determined to be approximately 48 inches from Officer Donald's weapon. And yet he claims at the point of the first incident that he was being pinned down and someone was directly above him, which would have put them within that 4-foot range. But there's no GSR. At the second incident, he claimed that Mr. Thompson was so close to him he couldn't hold out his weapon, but there was no GSR. There was DNA on his uniform, which was tested in 2 separate places, but although he was being pinned down, we were unable to put Andre or Bryson's DNA on his uniform in any place. There were no eyewitness statements that support Officer Donald's version of events, and there are discrepancies, as was kind of pointed out, there are actually more, between his version of events in the statement and his own words on the dispatch recording.
Yes.
Your office historically conservatively charges or chooses to prosecute cases, and you have a respectable conviction rate because in your office you tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to physical evidence that is contradictory, insufficient, or inconclusive. You don't have a record of throwing things at the wall to see what's going to stick. So the entirety of this charging decision seems uncharacteristic and almost unprecedented.
Thank you, thank
If
you.
this were a case that involved only civilian parties, I'm wondering if your charging decision with contradictory physical evidence would have been the same, or if your decision was influenced by the fact that one party was an officer. If you're giving heavy consideration and influence to the officer's expert testimony, would that not have been mitigated by the fact that the officer himself might have been charged? One more question, actually
Okay.
2.
Go on, girl.
You stated that there was no evidence that supported that the 2 suspects were shot in the back, but the medical records were not provided in the information that was provided to the public.
Yes.
So I'm wondering about their medical records, and I'm also wondering about the medical records of the officer himself from that night. And I am also wondering how long it took for the crime lab to come back in and do the trajectory report on the bullet wounds, and how long would be typical for that to take.
Okay. Yeah, you're right, there was a good list of questions there. So, and you might need to help, again, remind me of some of these. Let's see, let's talk about the gunshot residue issue. What I'm being told now by the scientists at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab is that they're no longer doing gunshot residue testing, and they're no longer doing it because they feel it's scientifically unreliable.
They did it a few weeks ago in this particular report, and his weapon was tested at a 48-inch range.
But what they will tell you is that the presence or absence of gunshot residue is not confirmatory one way or the other to the distance. It's not determinative. At least that's what I've been told.
Then do you feel that the language in the crime lab report then is misleading on that issue? Because it seems like it reads pretty clear to me.
I'll go back and review the specific language, but when I reviewed the report, I didn't, from that, I didn't interpret that as being conclusive. But I'll go back and look at it again and see if I've overlooked something there. That being said, the other issue is, and a lot of these facts revolve around looking at a comparison between the statement of the officer and physical evidence. And I'll say you're right on the right track in terms of how we analyze cases, because that was a large part of what I looked at in this particular case. There was something about, I was going to talk about, can you remind me again of the other questions that you had beside the gunshot residue? Because
Well, I mean,
I was trying to remember as you went through the list,
It was
but
long.
they were dropping off.
in that framework, I'm also curious about the fact that there were no DNA from the boys on
Yes,
Officer Donald's
Yes.
uniform when
Okay.
DNA was present, because some people will say DNA doesn't transfer, but there was DNA on
Yes.
his uniform.
there can be transfer DNA, and some of the DNA testing showed a mixture that was inconclusive.
And one sample specifically eliminated them.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the case, but again, I'll review that again and make sure, but the reality is, and maybe there's a general statement that can be made too about cases like this. Unfortunately, drama and media, I think, has created expectations among the community and folks that aren't working in this field about what DNA is capable of doing and about how often DNA is found. I've been a prosecutor for 25 years. I think I've had 5 or less cases that have actually involved DNA evidence that has been presented where I could go to trial, and they were all, if I recall right, all sexual. No, it was a sexually related homicide, but all sexual assault or sexual assault homicide kind of case where you're kind of specifically looking for that. The presence of DNA here would have certainly confirmed that there was some transfer of DNA from either Bryson or Andre to the officer. The absence of DNA does not confirm that there wasn't, because the scientists will tell you, if looking at it from a courtroom framework, when you put them on the stand, they will say that DNA does not always transfer, and even sometimes if it does, it's in such small quantity it can't be detected. And so they will not say that the absence of DNA really tells you anything. It's only the presence of DNA that will give you some inference that in fact there was a transfer.
I understand that, but this wasn't, according to the officer, it wasn't a casual contact. It wasn't a bump or a touch. It was a pin down. I know my time is up. Can I give you my list of questions? Could you write them down? And
Yeah.
maybe you could email me?
If you want to give them to Ann, that might help. One of the things that maybe we could look at doing is kind of a FAQ or something on our website where we could take some of these questions and give some responses in writing that people could see. I'd be happy to do that.
For a second meeting, I second that.
We
Yeah.
may need to do that as well. We'll see how this one goes and how far we get.
I am particularly interested in historical precedent in this district, in your jurisdiction, with this kind of charge.
I'll make one comment on that, but please leave your questions and I can follow up and answer
Actually,
more
excuse
completely.
me, I would like to defer my 3 minutes to you. I'm number 6 on the list. I'm quite sure there would have been time for me. I feel so emotional as a mother right now and as a professional that I know better than to speak in this forum. Can I give you my 3 minutes?
Can she give me her time?
Okay.
Thank you, and I do
Fine with
appreciate
me.
your record in office, and I hope that you really take us seriously, because we're not going away.
Okay. So my primary practice before I was elected to office was in the areas of domestic violence and child abuse. A good portion of the cases that I've charged and filed and tried were either physical or sexual abuse of a child. And in those cases, there is rarely, frankly, physical evidence. So you're looking at the statement of a child and you're kind of analyzing it against other statements by other witnesses and so forth, but you rarely have DNA or other kinds of corroborating evidence. And it's a challenge in a courtroom for the very reasons we've been talking about, because juries sometimes expect that before they'll convict or before they'll reach a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. But nonetheless, I've charged those cases and tried those cases because when I looked at the child's statement, I concluded that a jury could also look at it and find beyond a reasonable doubt that it was true. And in fact, I've been successful in that regard in a number of instances. So the only reason I say that is to tell you that all cases come to us in all kinds of different forms, with all kinds of different kinds of evidence. A mixture of testimony and a mixture of physical evidence and DNA and those kinds of things. And we look at each case individually and the evidence that it has. And ultimately what this came down to is that, I had a version of events that came from an officer that I, in my analysis, looked at and found to be consistent with the physical evidence. And I understand there's disagreement with that. And like I said, I'm listening, I'm thinking about that. But, that was the gist of my analysis. I did not have another version to look at, to analyze in terms of credibility there. And so in walking into a courtroom, I don't think I could in any way have proven malice or bad faith in this case beyond a reasonable doubt.
I understand that,
But
and we're not
with-
talking about charges against the officer. Unfortunately, in this forum, we're beyond that.
Yes.
We're talking about charges against the boys. And
Oh,
if
I see.
compare-
Yeah.
To compare a child molestation case where you do not see that child immediately after an event to a case like this where officers walked into a scene and sealed the entire scene and
Yeah.
all of the evidence was collected
Yeah.
immediately,
Yeah.
seems like an unfair comparison in terms of what evidence should or shouldn't be present.
Yeah. My point was only that we have charged cases based on testimony alone. We've charged cases based on testimony combined with physical evidence. The point that I was trying to make was that every case kind of stands on its own in terms of how we look at the evidence. And again, if you want to leave your questions, I'm happy to look through those and even maybe respond to some of the things where I said I'd go back and look at specific reports.
In my second 2 minutes, do I have time to ask a question about the medical record? Or is
This is your forum, so if you would like her to continue to speak, it's up to you.
I'm presuming other people probably want this
If you-
answer to that question.
We're gonna have a second meeting, and so Lisa, would it be all right if you were to come back at the second meeting and continue these questions?
Okay.
So Carl, what about the video? I mean, just.
I have a two-part question, so I'm going to ask and then you're going to respond and then I'm going to ask the second part. The first part is what criterion was used to determine that the fear of threat that Officer Ryan Donald had on Andre and Bryson was not racially motivated. What criterion was used? Can you please describe what questions were asked? Can you describe what the definitions were and how you define that? And also, what was it that you used to just really kind of figure out exactly what his biases are?
Okay. It's really difficult to determine people's biases, and that is part of what I'm looking for. But I need to make a very clear correction in terms of how this is being illustrated.
So you don't have a framework, just say that. We can move
Yeah,
on.
do you not have a framework at all for how you determine if race was a factor or not?
Since we only have 30 minutes.
My clarification is that I didn't find evidence here that racially motivated bias.
How did you try to collect that evidence?
How can you look for it?
I don't collect the evidence. I only take the evidence that's given to me by the investigators, and I look at that evidence, and I'm looking for any indicators to me in there that might.
What would be the indicators?
Are
If
your
there was,
investigators, are they the ones who know how to look for bias? In instances where you have two young black men, unarmed,
Okay,
who
so.
get shot, that's the question, and I apologize, I won't speak again.
Okay. So, again, a clarification, not my investigators. Okay, I need to be very clear. My role is to accept an investigation that is done, to review that, and to make decisions based on the investigation, the evidence that's presented to me.
So then, what were the indicators that you were looking for to show that there was or was not racial bias? What was?
Basically, anything that might lead itself to an inference like that, and but that's integrated into an overall analysis of it. Is there anything that would give me indication of malice? Because bias, racial bias, is not part of the elements of the crime that I would be looking at or proving. What I'm really looking at is there malice? Now, if there was evidence of a racially motivated bias, that might in and of itself then be additional evidence to look at the ultimate question of malice. That's the question.
So there was no criterion for determining if this police officer had implicit bias. So then, how was it determined that race was not a factor? If there was no criterion, how did you then make the determination that race was not a factor?
My conclusion was that there's no evidence that race was a factor.
What does evidence look like?
It could be in the form of statements. It could be in the form of things said before or afterwards. I mean, that's really kind of the indication that I would be looking for.
People aren't dumb enough to shout racial things out loud. We
Yeah.
live in 2015, sir.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there, but I can't make it up either. I mean, I can only go on the evidence that's presented to me. So
And so do you believe
my
that
decision is
your,
there's no, I didn't find any evidence of that. I can't subjectively reach into the
so are you
officer's head.
saying that this investigation and your decision to charge the boys, that it was very incomplete because you did not actually look to see if what criterion there was beyond just a very visible racial bias? Because that's what it is. You guys have a very incomplete investigation then, and you're complicit in that.
So tell me what you would mean by the word criterion.
How would you be able to go, did you ask him, did you guys ask, do you have any racial biases? Did you ask, or did you, were the investigators asking that? Were the investigators going through any of the racial bias tests that are put out, that people can do to see that even if there's implicit bias, even if he's not explicitly stating it, and in your process, when you were analyzing this investigation, did that blip in your mind that there was that it was incomplete because they did not question him about racial bias?
The answer to that is I accepted the investigation that I received, and I reviewed that, and I looked for, any kind of racial bias along with anything else that might have indicated malice, because that's the question I was looking for.
Would you say it's
Was there
malicious,
malice?
according to the Washington Post, that basically every 9 seconds a black man in this country since April has been gunned down, killed, unarmed? Would that not be an indicator to you that maybe something could be wrong in this investigation, that you, sir, are not receiving thorough information? It could be possible that you're not really receiving thorough information. You have an officer who claims he's scared, but then you have an officer who's also chasing people into the woods. Those two things are inconsistent.
But I can't make decisions based on what might be possible or kind of theoretical. And when we walk into a courtroom...
Frameworks are theoretical, sir.
But when we walk into a courtroom, the data that you're talking about,
Yes.
not admissible. It's not coming into evidence.
So you're
Why
saying
would-
that racial biases there's no way to actually define them, and that they're not part of how you decided any of these charges?
The focus would be, if there was a racially biased aspect of this, the focus of that would be in a context of analyzing the question of malice.
All right.
Okay?
Thank you for admitting that this was an incomplete investigation and that you were not interested in actually completing
I
it.
think that's your characterization of what
It
I
might
did.
actually be malice. It actually might be malice to shoot someone. I mean, how many times does an officer actually shoot his weapon in his career? You talked about your career experience of only, 5 instances of DNA in your very illustrious career. So is it normative for an officer with, 5 years less or less experience to shoot 2 people in the back that aren't armed? Is that normative? Wouldn't that put up a red flag? We can even take the question of color out of this picture for a moment. It just doesn't seem reasonable, and I'm very upset as a mother that I have to worry or tell my children that they have to behave differently because, yes, in fact, they are black and Native. There's more to the story, and I think it really is in your department's best interest, and the policing agencies who I've had personal contact with, and I've been very embarrassed by some of the behaviors that the officers have exhibited to me when I call them for help, okay? I think somebody really needs to look at the interactions between your officers, your agencies, and the code of law, the blue wall, and the reactions that people have, unfortunately, when they're not trained to deal with people across culture. That's basically it, and I do apologize for my emotion, but then I cannot just sit here. I thought about chaining myself to the front door of the police building as soon as I found out what happened here. This is happening in my backyard now. It's not in virtual television. Are we lucky these boys aren't dead? Are we supposed to think that we're going to keep quiet now because somebody didn't actually end up dead? Because I trust and believe it's only a matter of time if you don't squash this. And I really do think that you have a good heart and your intention is to meet with us and really do something different. This is an opportunity now. This is an opportunity for this city to do something really different, shine a light in this situation, and show how we can all come together in a respectful way and do something about this.
Let me say this. I appreciate the emotion. Don't think that escapes me, that I understand the emotion that's involved in this issue. And I've already been meeting with other community groups that have expressed that similar emotion. I get that. I knew that that was a factor. I mean, I knew that that would be present when I made the decision. And of course, I hope you all understand that my job is really to make a decision without emotion, to try to be objective.
I can be emotional.
That is the role that I have in analyzing this. Now, the second thing I want to say.
You mean you're not emotional when you hear a kid's been shot? Sir, I don't believe that. You're not.
If my child was a victim, I wouldn't be making the decision.
So you agree
Okay.
that they
What's that?
You agree that they were the victims in it? If your child was
Thank
a victim, what you just said.
No,
Sure,
that's
tell
not what I
it.
said. I said if my child was shot.
You said your child was a victim.
You said
Oh, the camera's bad. Please,
Okay, no, let's be respectful. Let's be respectful. This is a very highly charged
It
situation.
is.
And he is here.
Let me kind of finish my thought that I originally started
Yes.
with. And basically what I was trying to do is acknowledge the emotion.
Thank you.
So I get that. And I guess I want to agree that the bigger issues that you've raised, the cultural policy, all of those issues, important discussions for this community and every other community across the country. I absolutely acknowledge that. But again, my specific goal in the decision I made here is, can I walk into a courtroom and what can I prove and what can't I prove? So if we can pull those things apart and acknowledge the decision that I made with the specific role that I have, but then use this incident as a way to build energy around the bigger picture policy conversations. I support that. I think that is that would be an important outcome to all of this.
I agree.
We're going to move on to the next person, and that is Emma.
Alright, what role do you think race plays in the Olympia Police Department interactions with the public? That's the first question.
That's a good question. I think that's an appropriate question, but not necessarily an appropriate question for me in this format or in this circumstance.
You judge
Why
the
not?
cases.
I personally, I look at I looked at this case, and I've looked at other cases from Olympia Police over the years, but right now my attention is focused on this case. And so I was looking at the evidence here, and as I said before, specifically looking to see if there was evidence of malice. And that's where I would have been looking for any indicia of racial bias or racial motive. And I didn't find that in this case, or at least I didn't find evidence of that in this case.
Didn't find evidence of explicit.
And it's an implicit bias is evidence that I don't think could be brought into a courtroom to prove a very specific case. I don't think that it's my place to judge the overall police practices of the Olympia Police Department. I'm going to refrain from doing that. I think that is something that needs to be done in another forum, either with the police department or with the ad hoc committee that's currently looking at that issue among others, or in other forums. I don't consider myself sitting in judgment of the racial practices of the police department unless it affects a case and does so very specifically and with evidence. Okay. Thank you. I know an unsatisfactory answer, but I guess that's the one I have. I'm not going to, I don't want to comment on, generally on the Olympia Police Department's policing practices.
Because you're in bed with them.
Can you comment on your own, like, whenever you were looking at this kind of stuff?
You mean in terms of how I'm analyzing it, or can you clarify the question?
I mean, I feel like we're going a lot off of the last question.
Which was? What was the last question?
Well, the last question that Cara was asking.
Yeah,
I feel like this is kind of like stemming from it.
Yeah. Okay, again, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm really trying to understand the question that you're asking. But I keep coming back to this statement that I made, that my review of this, when I'm looking at whether I can prove a crime, I'm looking at the elements of the crime. That one of the elements that I would have to prove here, if I would have charged this officer with anything, was that I would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he acted either, well, not either, but with malice and bad faith. I'd have to prove those things beyond a reasonable doubt.
So can you prove without a reasonable doubt that he acted with that he acted without malice or without good faith?
That's not my burden. So if I charge somebody with a crime and I walk into court, the burden is on me to prove that there is malice beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
That's the standard that I'm held to, and that's how I'm looking at the case, because I would have the burden of proof.
So what about Andre and Bryson?
Against the
Drop the
officer.
charges. Yeah.
So you can apply that to Andre and Bryson? Like you can assert that they
The-
had malice in this case? You have evidence supporting this idea that they were acting with malice?
I believe that the evidence, when presented to a jury, that a jury could find them guilty, and that's the standard that I use to make a charging
You didn't
decision.
have
What
to drop
evidence?
charges.
Ultimately, it's going to be to a judge or jury, whoever hears the case, to make the decision about whether that is proven beyond a reasonable doubt or not.
Would you support publicly legislative efforts to raise the bar
Yes.
in terms of prosecutions on officer-involved shootings? Because Washington State Bar with the malice word in
Yes,
there is
is uni-
particularly low and ambiguous.
Yes.
Would you publicly support efforts to change the language around prosecution of officer-involved shootings?
Depends. It depends on what the alternative choice is. Now, I'll tell you very candidly that the conversations among all the prosecutors in this state, and I get together with all the elected prosecutors in this state 4 times a year, so that we can talk about policy issues like that. And that policy issue has been discussed even before this case came up, because of the other cases that have been happening nationally. We've had that conversation. I don't think all prosecutors in this state are of one mind on that. But I think there is agreement that that's an appropriate discussion, given what's going on in this state and across the country. And that word malice does set a very high standard. Now, you're using low, I'm using high, because, again, my burden of proof, if I were to charge, is going in to prove that. And malice is a high standard for me to prove.
It's ambiguous is what it is.
But most terms in the law have ambiguity, beyond a reasonable doubt, for instance. A very ambiguous phrase.
Depends if it's
but
civil
we
or
let-
criminal.
What's that?
That depends if it's civil or criminal. The bar changes depending on the,
Yes.
on the type of prosecution you're
Criminal is
seeking.
beyond a reasonable doubt. Civil is by a preponderance of the evidence.
Exactly.
I'm looking at it beyond a reasonable doubt. And I guess my point is that the fact that there are phrases in the law that can't be measured is
Yes.
it's inherent in the law. It's the nature of the beast. But I do think that there needs to be a conversation on a policy level, and that this is a legislative conversation, not a case-specific conversation,
And at times of
about whether the
election.
word malice is an appropriate standard.
Right.
Now, whether I or any other prosecutor would support a change to that, in my view, depends on what is the change that's proposed. What's the alternative, and whether we feel like that would be appropriately balance the need for officers to protect themselves and the community but also hold them to accountability if excessive force is used.
Did you personally know Officer Donald before this incident?
To my memory, I've never met Officer Donald. Yeah, I don't recall ever having met him. And maybe that sounded disingenuous, I don't know, but, you know, I meet a lot of people, and it's inherent in my job. But when I saw him, I saw his photograph, all of that, I have no memory of ever meeting him, and I've not talked to him personally at all during this process.
So we have 10 more minutes and a lot more names. So if I say your name and it's already been addressed, if you want me, let me get out the next name. That's an option. But I have Steve Baker, sorry.
Hello. I was wondering, I guess first, an ignorant yes or no question in terms of legal processes. Indicia of racial bias, would that, in a case like this, only be considered within the parameters of a factor in indicating malice?
I would look at it as what might commonly be called motive. And one of the ways that you would look at proving malice is by trying to determine motive.
Okay, then I guess in terms of your job description, do you take the police report pretty much at face value and evaluate that?
Well, I have no independent investigative resources in my office, so I don't have any investigators that work for me. I don't have any resources to spend on investigators. So I am dependent or reliant on the information that comes to me in these investigations to do my analysis. Now, we do have the ability to ask for and seek follow-up to specific questions. So if we're looking at something and we say, we feel like we have a question on this, we can ask for that follow-up and you know, hopefully get that. So that's the kind of the back and forth process that goes on. But I don't have any independent investigative resources myself, and I don't, as an individual, go out and investigate.
So but the original inputs that the follow-up might come from would be the police.
The investigative report.
That single investigative report?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, not single. I mean, there's a variety of different officers' reports, and then there's also the recorded statements of the witnesses that come in, and we have access to both the transcript and the recording itself. Photographs, video, things that were taken at the scene, other evidence that's been, like the Safeway videos, for instance, the radio traffic. That's all bundled together into what I would call the reports.
Okay. And then you had a back and forth about particular aspects.
That's possible. Mm-hmm. You mean in terms of we ask a question or seek some follow-up?
Yeah, did you ask for follow-up in this case? I didn't ask for any specific follow-up in terms of, you know, basically saying, we've looked at this, go back and follow up on this, come back. Because when we looked at this case, we felt like the decision could be reliably made on the reports that we had. Now, there is a deputy prosecutor that's available for investigators to consult with throughout the investigation. So, for instance, they might, if they have a question about how to get a search warrant, or do they have enough information to get a search warrant, or whatever, they might come up and talk to a deputy prosecutor. So I don't want to be confused in saying, in some ways, there's follow-up kinds of interactions there. But in this case, it's not like it came over, we looked at it and said, oh, we need to have some more work done, and we sent it back. We made our decision on what we received. All right.
Okay?
So we have Olympia, but would you like another opportunity? Or?
At this time, I don't want to take another opportunity. I'd like to defer to someone else in the room.
And so then I have Shelley.
First of all, I'd like to say that I'm a registered voter in Thurston County, in Olympia.
Okay.
I urge everybody to vote.
Me too.
Now, given that these charges are assault on a police officer, right?
Yes.
Am I correct?
Yes.
How do you address the fact that as a part of the law enforcement system, the prosecuting attorney is a part of the law enforcement system, how do you address the conflict of interest?
Yes. Yeah, yes.
Good question. And again, there's a part of that that is a policy debate in terms of how our Washington government is structured, and that lies with somewhere else. I will say that I think for those of us who work in the system, as you've described it, the law enforcement system, would agree that that the culture of the system recognizes and respects the different roles that different agencies or individuals have. And that includes not just law enforcement and prosecutors, but also the court and the role the court has in resolving cases.
And the U.S. Department of Justice, which is an outside external agency that can come here and pay us all a visit.
Yes.
Which might need to happen. Have you thought about inviting them to the process or to the table, or would you suggest that for us?
They, well, I haven't talked to them directly about the case.
Yeah.
That is a determination that whoever at that level needs to make. I've interacted with them in other cases, and if they wanted to take a look at this case, I'd be happy to meet with them and talk with them about it, if they feel like there's been some reason to look at it. And I've done that before.
You were saying
But
that
let me finish my thought.
you respect all these different institutions within the legal system. You're saying you respect them. Do you hold any critique of what they have to say, and that they might be, because we do know that these institutions, including your own, is really, and the whole legal system of the United States is based in racism. So when you are making decisions like this, especially with an institution that you respect, are you also holding them up to critique the same way that you're holding the public up to critique?
Yes.
So let me finish my thought and see if it answers your question. But to be honest with you, I don't think the answer is going to address the statement that you just made.
Then don't give it.
Okay, so what I was saying is, there is a respect for the role that each of these agencies plays. And so I was going through the list: law enforcement, prosecution, court, defense lawyer, all of the different aspects of the system. We all know, understand, and respect the role of the other in the process. And that's very much true in cases that where law enforcement brings a case to the prosecutor for us to make a decision in a charge. They understand that I'm an independently elected public official, that I have separate accountability to the voters of this county, that I'm not accountable to them for my decisions, and that I will make the decision based on the legal criteria I have in front of me as an elected official. And so there isn't this kind of law enforcement basically saying, well, here it is, and by the way, you've got to decide it this way. They know, they respect, and they're very careful not to intrude on my decision-making role. And I've already, I guess, alluded to the second thing, and that is that I am an independently elected official.
We have time for one more, and so this gentleman's.
Okay.
Actually, they would like to go. So, how would you yourself personally, I'm not talking on a structural level, how would you yourself personally define racism and, I guess, like, could you honestly say that if these were two white people, that the treatment would have been the same? I mean, who isn't, like, stolen something from a convenience store when they were they were yogurt. Is that warrant enough to warrant your life almost being taken from you? And so, yeah.
Okay. Again, a few questions bundled there, so let me see if I can answer those.
Stop being condescending, just answer the question.
Okay, not my intent to be condescending.
You sound,
Doesn't matter.
your intent doesn't matter.
Yeah, and this is our last question for today. It's 11 o'clock and he is already running a little bit over, so.
We're all running a little bit over.
Yeah,
You got here late.
I'm spilling over myself.
Okay, so let me answer the questions. First thing is, the shop, in my mind, the way that I looked at this case.
What was the first question? It was, could you please?
It was about racism.
How do you define racism?
How do I define racism?
Did you forget about that one?
This is not a
Basically,
legal
does
definition
stealing
by any
candy from the
means.
store warrant getting shot in the back as you're running into the woods? I think that's the person saying, that doesn't sound right to me. I mean, you personally.
But not the facts of this case.
Yeah, I'm not addressing the facts of this case. I'm asking you, do you personally think?
What is racism?
Yeah, what is racism?
The treatment, treating people differently based on race, color, creed, religion, sexual orientation.
Personal definition.
Just racism.
Same answer.
They're all the same.
Yeah.
So stealing candy from the candy store, shoplifting like this gentleman just pointed out. I mean, when we were all kids, we might have did things we shouldn't have done.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Does that warrant excessive force?
No, I haven't actually.
Excessive force, shooting someone in the back or shooting someone at all for beer, for candy.
What's the
As
worst
they're
thing
running
that's going to
away.
happen if you
Where's
drop
the
the
threat
charges?
there? I don't understand
Yeah,
how the officer.
What's the worst? What do you have to risk if you drop the charges? Are you worried about your job? What about the people who got shot in the back?
My job, my role is to, when evidence supports the probability that a jury would convict somebody of a crime, to take that case, to charge it and take it to a jury.
What
Were they
evidence?
married?
What evidence that they assaulted a police officer?
Did someone read the Miranda Act? Were those boys arrested properly? Were they properly?
you a racist?
They,
Are your parents racist?
You can't define racism.
How do you know you're not
racial,
racist?
racial
What is
bias.
systematic
So I think
racism?
there are a lot of questions that do need to be answered and can be addressed, and we just don't have the time capacity to do it.
Did the
today.
officer follow protocol according to the mission statement of the Ole PD?
Drop
No,
the
he didn't.
charges! Drop the charges! Drop the charges!
So for today's meeting, John is gonna go, and I'm happy to meet with everyone after this and
Thank
get
you, John.
comments and get
For
questions.
showing up. I do
I
appreciate
do,
that.
so, with no further ado, John's gonna leave, and I'm happy to connect with
Get
everyone
back! Get
after the
back! We
class.
want freedom!